All right, y'all. Just when you thought you were done with Stalin, but wait, there's more. Now, we've talked about the Russian Revolution and how Russia went from being an imperial empire to a Soviet state of 15 Soviet socialist republics. And we looked at the early years of the state, how the Russian people had been dealing with World War One, and then pretty much got out of World War One, had the revolution, and then got into a civil war. So we know that the economy was really struggling initially in the Soviet state, and we know that people were feeling really frustrated. Lenin is going to do some things, including have his new economic policy where he's going to allow low-key capitalism and do a whole bunch of other things to consolidate his power. And then unexpectedly, we know that he dies, which then leaves a power vacuum, which then allows this mustachioed man to take power in 1929. Let's talk a little bit more about what he does once he gains power. So, first of all, we know that Stalin, once he gains power, he is super paranoid and he really wants to consolidate his power entirely. He's going to move the Soviet Union from a dictatorship of the proletariat under Marxist dreams and ideals to a totalitarian dictatorship. We know that that means that it's going to be extreme one-party rule, lots of propaganda and indoctrination, lots of fear, and extreme control by the government. Let's talk a little bit more about how that fear really comes about. So going more in depth with Stalin's totalitarian state, the first thing that happens is that Stalin is crazy paranoid and he's going to want to get rid of all of his enemies. So one of the first things that happen is this great purge of enemies of the state, of Bolshevik enemies. Who are these enemies? These are men and women, mostly men, who participated in the revolution of 1917, as well as almost every leader in Stalin's government is going to be arrested at some point. And spoiler alert, Stalin's going to take over in 1929. That's when he's declared dictator. He's going to rule until 1953. So for those, how many years is that? 34 years, if I can do my math correctly. He is going to really control a lot. Is that 34 years? It might be 24 years. Regardless, it's a long time, and Stalin does a lot of stuff. So throughout these decades of time that Stalin's under control, he is definitely going to have a lot of people fall out of favor with him. So a lot of leaders in the Soviet government gets arrested. In addition, we're going to see army officers, so people serving in the army, diplomats, those are going to be our foreign dignitaries, people that are like, working for the government, all those bureaucrats, intellectuals, and including ordinary citizens. No one is spared Stalin's Great Purge. What are these people charged with? Committing crimes against the Soviet state. Nothing more explicit than that. Anything you do that Stalin doesn't like could be considered a crime against the Soviet state. So you're not sure how you're running afoul of Stalin, but you're doing something and Stalin is going to get you. What happens once you're arrested? Many people get put on these show trials, which are public trials of those that are charged, in which they publicize them. They put it on the radio. They write about it in the news. So-and-so was charged with crime against the Soviet state. And then they capture through radio, through other media, the actual judgment of these people where they try to defend themselves, and then the judges basically saying, nope, you have committed a crime, you are convicted of this crime, etc. And the result of this is that 8 to 13 million, we don't know the numbers, but millions of people are killed at this time. In addition, more millions are sent to work camps called gulags up in Siberia. Really horrible, super intense experiences. What is the result of all this? Lots of fear in citizens, because nobody knows what you could do that could make you be in trouble with the Soviet government. So there's constantly this fear of someone could tell on me, and then I could get in trouble. So a lot of fear for the Soviet Union. This is a major, major area of fear. And also think about the propaganda and indoctrination. There's so much propaganda, so much indoctrination that you should be a good citizen, and good citizens tell on bad citizens. So there's a lot of reinforcement of tell on your neighbor. So everyone's watching everyone. It's a culture of extreme paranoia and extreme fear. What else is Stalin going to do? So, he's making everyone feel super freaked out and super nervous about their lives. He's also going to control the economy. So he's going to take Lenin's new economic policy, which was that low-key capitalism, in which small farmers, small businessmen, and women could own their own wealth and have their own private ownership of things. And he's going to get rid of that entirely. And instead, he's going to say this is an economy that's controlled by the government. This is a command economy, that the government commands what the economy is going to do. That means that there are going to be laws enacted that are going to limit workers' freedoms and control every aspect of a worker's life. So basically, they're going to control where people worked, what they worked on, what type of professions they had. There was no longer the sense of like, oh, you know what? I really like printing. I'm going to work in the newspaper field. No, now you're told you're working in the newspaper. You're working in the factory. You're going to be making light bulbs. You're going to be making steel. You're going to be working on the farms. And literally, like, people are just told where to go and what to work and what to do. So this is, again, another aspect where we see this totalitarian, that the government has total control over people's lives. It's not just they're saying this is the type of government we have and these are the type of laws we have. It's now this is the type of government we have. These are the laws we have. This is where you're going to work. This is how much you are going to make. This is where you will be living due to your work. So super control, super command economy. In addition, we're going to see tons of propaganda. The Soviet propaganda at this time is just phenomenal and fascinating. So you can see there's an example up in the right corner there in which propaganda is encouraging workers to sacrifice their time, sacrifice themselves to increase production. Because remember, under a totalitarian state, you are no longer an individual citizen. You are a person of the state first and an individual second. So you should be living your life for the state and nothing else. Anything else, any private feelings, any personal feelings, that all comes second to your role as a citizen of the state. And the propaganda is everywhere. So the indoctrination, the brainwashing of people to believe in this is widespread. Stalin is going to continue his beliefs with the economy, with this command economy, and he's going to come up with these 5-year plans. He actually has several of them, but the first 5-year plan comes out in 1928. So he says, look, in 5 years, here's what the government is going to do. We are going to promote rapid industrial growth and strengthen our military. Why? Because Russia is far behind. They're often known as the weak man of Europe. And this has been a thing for Russia ever since, like, Peter the Great, going back to like the 17th century, for all you 17th century fans out there, that Russia's always been looking west and always trying to catch up with Europe. Remember, Industrial Revolution, England, then Germany, France, mainly continental Europe, they're all going to industrialize. So what's going to lead to these massive armies and all the technology and all the devastation of World War I. Remember, also in World War I, Russia gets their butt kicked, so much so that the Russian soldiers actually mutiny, which then leads to the revolution, etc., etc. So Stalin's like, not going to happen under my watch. There's not going to be any of those mutinies, anyone feeling bad about themselves. So instead, we are going to have major industrial growth. And he's going to say, look, you are going to make all these quotas. And a quota is a amount that workers have to produce. So you could say, like, you're going to produce and make like 100 light bulbs a day, or you are going to grow 50 bushels of wheat each week. So it's like a limit of how much people should be producing and making. So he's going to set these impossibly high quotas, these numbers that are like impossible to actually reach, to increase output of steel, coal, electricity, and oil. So all the industrial items, all the industrial factors that are needed to make Russia a massive industrial state. To reach this, in order to reach these quotas, these numbers that have been forced upon the Soviet people, Russia is going to limit the production of consumer goods. So whereas they might have had factories that made X amount of industrial goods for machinery, for the government, for the military, and then X amount for consumers, for the everyday people to use, now everything's going to the military, to the government, to these big items. And the consumers, sorry, you get nothing. But you're a good citizen of the state, so you don't complain, because bad citizens complain. And what happens if you're a bad citizen? You could be convicted of a crime against the Soviet state, put on a show trial, end up in a Siberian gulag, or worse, be put to death. So there's a lot of fear that's happening. This is why people are going along with it, despite the fact that it's massively going to hurt the population. It's going to lead to a lot of death and devastation under Stalin. But again, people are not going to be rejecting that because, of course, all that fear and indoctrination. So that's what's looking at the industrial aspect. Stalin is also going to be looking at the agriculture. Russia is a major landmass with so much agriculture, able to produce so much food products. And Stalin, of course, is going to say, look, let's revolutionize that as well. So you might remember from freshman year learning about the agriculture revolution. It predates the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution, when you start seeing like enclosure of farms and lots of other farming things that made people able to grow more food. So Stalin's going to be like, let's grow some more food as well. It's super successful, but at the major expense of a lot of lives. So what Stalin's going to do, he's going to look at these 26 million private farms all throughout Russia, and instead he's going to seize them and combine them into 250,000 huge collective farms. So basically, Stalin is going to take these millions of private individual farms and join them together into these massive giant farms that are collective farms. A collective farm is a farm that's joined together. So it's a bunch of different farms that are now one major farm, and it's owned by the government and worked collectively by all the farmers. So whereas farmers produce, they get to own and sell and then, make profit off of under the new economic policy. And then under the initial command economy, they would then give to the government and then receive payment from the government. Now, you're all working in one big farm together. It'd be like if I said, all right, instead of us in room 136, we are producing our cool items in 136, and then we get to keep the profit of what we produce. Now we are joining together with all of the history hall, all the English hall, all the world language hall, everyone on the east side of campus. We're all working together. We're all producing together. And then the government is going to distribute our resources and our wealth as they see fit. So it's the opposite of private ownership. It's the opposite of capitalism. Everyone is working together. And in fact, people are like living together on these farms. There's no privacy. There's, like you have like these giant houses, these giant bunk houses essentially, where people are living, raising their families together. The children all being raised together. So in some respects, you'd be like, oh, it's so idyllic. It's the village that's taking care of the children and stuff. But really, this lack of privacy just is another aspect of like this indoctrination, because you're constantly watching everyone. You're constantly telling on people who are doing bad things and reinforcing that culture of fear. Now, as you can imagine, many people were not too excited about these collective farms, to go from my own private ownership to now I have to share with everyone, and I don't have my own space and everyone's watching, etc. So we do get peasants that revolt at this time by like burning them all and being like, well, if I can't have my crops, neither can you. So they go through and they destroy their crops, they kill off all their livestock. It's pretty intense and messed up. And what does Stalin do in response? He's basically going to work these people to death. Like, literally, he's going to be like, either you work or you are killed. And in fact, 5 to 10 million peasants are killed, with many more millions being sent to those work gulags in Siberia. If you're hearing a weird noise, that's my dog. She's scratching herself, so... Yep, there she goes again. Good job, Effie. So, to recap what's happening... Stalin's going to collectivize all the farms. He's basically going to take all the private farms and put them all together into larger collective farms. And if people don't like it, they are either forced to work, or they are sent to work camps, or they die. And that's what's going to happen to millions and millions and millions of lives during this time. And again, if you talk about it and if you question it, then you are no longer a good citizen. And that could be a crime against the Soviet state. So the culture of fear is massive. If you see your neighbor, your old peasant farmer neighbor, who revolted and tried to kill their livestock and said they weren't going to work, and now suddenly they're gone, you can best believe that they are at best sent to a work camp in Siberia, but most likely have been put to death. Now, there was one specific group of peasants known as the kulaks, and these were a wealthier group of peasants. So these were people that were more well-off, not your average, everyday farmer. They full-on revolted. Like, their entire group of them And there's probably about like 6 million or so of them that they revolt, and their entire class, like all the kulaks across Russia, are sent to death or the work camps at best. And after a couple of years, there are no more kulaks. The entire class of people, the entire group of people, are totally gone. During this time, in addition to all the peasants that are being killed, slash all the other millions of peasants that are being sent to work camps, you also just have 10 plus million peasants that are starved during this time, during essentially government-sponsored famine. The government's not saying like, oh, we're going to starve our people, but because they are putting these impossibly high quotas on the peasants and on the farms, and because they are taking all the resources, because remember, this is a command economy, so the government gets to decide where the resources are going, and because they take all the food products and then send them to the military and send them to these other groups and peoples, etc., that they determine are in need, you're just going to have millions of people that like die of starvation because they can't access the food that they are growing. It's pretty messed up and super intense and really heartbreaking when you think about it. And remember, I'm constantly trying to remind you that, yes, it's easy to follow the statistics and to look at 10 million and think, wow, that's a big number, but those are human lives. Those are people, those are families, those are men, women, and children, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, etc., whose lives are lost because of a government that is abusing its privilege and abusing its power. And that's something that I never want us to forget, because that is one of the major legacies to understand about the Soviet Union, as well as other subsequent dictatorships and governments where power is abused. So to start to wrap up, let's think about what Stalin does in his first 10 years. And remember, we're going to keep talking about him, so this is not the last we hear of him. But in the first 10 years, wheat production is doubled due to this collective farming. It's super efficient at the expense of the loss of life, but very efficient, very effective. Electrical production goes up 800%. I don't even know how that's possible. That's such a huge number. But basically, the electrical production, the amount of people that had access to electricity, the amount of buildings, etc., that were powered by electricity, doesn't double, doesn't triple. It goes up by 800%, a massive number. Steel production is increased from 4 to 18 million metric tons. Again, I can't actually fathom what that number is, what that actually looks like, but we can all understand that that is a ton of steel. So Russia is going from kind of this backwards, like, second industrial power, second always behind continental Europe, behind England and Germany and France, and now they are a player, right? They have the electricity, they have steel, they have all the industry. Russia is going to industrialize rapidly and become a major industrial power. So Stalin, he's pretty brutal, right? But he's also super effective. And as you can see in this cool propaganda here, these people are really happy about it. That lady here, she is just shouting, "Yay! Yay, we're a major industrial power. It's so exciting." And those guys on the right, they are just marching on to industrialize the nation. So finally, what is the end result of all of this? Again, thinking back to the beginning of Russia with the Civil War, and then Lenin consolidating his power, and then dying, Stalin consolidating his power and turning Russia from a idealistic communist idea to this totalitarian dictatorship in which the government has total control over people's personal and public lives, in which the government is able to kind of expand their control through indoctrination, through propaganda, through fear, through command economy, through the cult of the leader, through all those traits of totalitarianism. And then the decisions that Stalin makes at the expense of human lives to collectivize the farms, to increase industrial output. What does this ultimately lead to? This totalitarian dictatorship? Russia is incredibly industrially strong. And in addition, is a very strong centralized state. So that means that people are paying the price for all these economic and all these industrial gains. And in addition, the government is centralized. It is localized. It is Stalin. It is Stalin's government, which is really massive to think about because Russia is a giant country. It's the largest country on earth with millions of people. And at this time, it's one of the most populous nations in the world. And yet, Stalin has total control over his people. How is he able to do this? This culture of fear. Through the show trials, what happens to the kulaks, and the Great Purge makes citizens scared of the government. They are scared that they could potentially be the next victim to run afoul. So they are always watching themselves, always making sure that they are doing everything right because they do not want to be the next victim. And finally, you have this major cult of Stalin, in which Stalin is basically the center of everything. And remember, Russia had been a hugely religious, the Russian Orthodox Church was incredibly powerful, one of the most powerful forces of the Russians throughout their entire history. And that church is kicked out and it's replaced with this cult of Stalin. So all that religious fervor and excitement and intent, Stalin is now the center of. And this is due to indoctrination, propaganda, censorship. You never hear anything bad about Stalin. You only hear the good stuff, and it's just reinforcing you are brainwashed into believing that Stalin is the best, which is another way that this culture of fear plays out because it's hard to even imagine, but the brainwashing is so immense at this time. And then finally, Stalin's potential threats and his enemies are just taken out and removed. So they've been censored themselves, censored by their life. Um, and that's where we will leave today. So, what have we talked about? We've seen Russia go on this major trajectory, which ends with Russia being a major totalitarian power, with Stalin being a true totalitarian dictatorship, very brutal with his means, but unfortunately also very effective. As we continue, we will continue to look a little more in depthly at some of Stalin's actions and then start to see how the Soviet Union is going to play out against other countries at the same time that are also turning to dictatorships and then turning to aspects of totalitarianism, which will then culminate in a little event called World War II. But that's a story for another day. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. Have a good evening, my children, and I'll see you all in class soon.